When I saw the Instagram post, it felt like a punch in the gut. Jessica, my younger sister, smiling with a brightly colored cocktail in her hand, captioned it something about living her best life. The background, a luxurious villa perched over crystal-clear waters with a sunset to die for, was unmistakably in Hawaii. My hand froze mid-scroll as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. A week ago, my parents, Robert and Margaret, had sat me down, looking genuinely distraught. My dad's supposed heart condition was worsening, they said, and they needed money, a lot of it, for treatments. They never mentioned specifics, but they didn't have to. They've always been proud, the kind of people who hated asking for help. So, when they finally came to me, I didn't hesitate. I wired them $55,000 the next day, trusting their every word. But now? Now I was staring at a photo that made my stomach churn. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was a vacation. Worse, it wasn't just Jessica. As I looked closer at the picture, I noticed familiar faces in the reflection of the glass doors behind her. My parents were there, laughing and holding drinks of their own. My hand gripped the phone so tightly that I thought I might crack it. Questions swirled in my mind. How long had they planned this? How could they look me in the eye, lie so convincingly, and take my hard-earned money for something like this? I tried calling my mom first. No answer. I sent a text, then another. Still nothing. My dad? Straight to voicemail. Jessica? She didn't even bother to read the message. Each ignored attempt stoked the fire in my chest. The audacity of it all was infuriating. It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal. I'd always trusted them. I'd grown up believing family came first. We weren't perfect, but we had each other's backs. Or so I thought. Unable to sit still, I grabbed my car keys and headed to their house. It was late evening by the time I pulled up. The driveway was empty, and the curtains were drawn. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Peering through the windows confirmed what I already suspected. The place was dark, lifeless. They weren't home. They were still out there, probably sipping cocktails and laughing at how easily I fell for their sob story. Driving back to my apartment, my mind raced with possibilities. Was this the first time they'd done something like this? Had I just been blind to it before? My parents had never seemed like the kind of people who would do something so calculated. And Jessica? She wasn't even subtle about it. Posting on social media? Did she think I wouldn't see it? I couldn't let this go. Not this time. They'd crossed a line, and I wasn't about to sit back and pretend it didn't happen. They'd have to come home eventually, and when they did, they'd find me waiting. I was done being the gullible son, the one they could count on to clean up their messes or bail them out. This time, they'd face the consequences. I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, but one thing was clear, I wasn't letting this slide. When they finally came back, it was as if nothing had happened. Jessica casually invited me over, her voice chipper and carefree, with no hint of an apology or explanation. She even sounded excited, as though I should be thrilled to see them after their tropical getaway. I didn't need an invitation, though. I had already decided to confront them the moment they returned. Walking into Jessica's apartment, I was greeted by the sight of her unpacking souvenirs. A stack of shell necklaces sat on the counter, next to bags of macadamia nuts and other Hawaiian trinkets. My parents were there too, sitting on the couch, looking relaxed and tanned. The sight of them, so at ease, made my blood boil. They didn't even flinch when I walked in, as if they had nothing to hide. Without wasting a second, I demanded an explanation. My voice was calm but firm, though inside I was seething. They didn't even try to deny it. My mom sighed heavily, as if I were the one inconveniencing her, and admitted they'd lied. They didn't need the money for medical bills. My dad chimed in, saying they'd been under a lot of stress lately and needed a break to recharge. He said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, as if I should have known and just handed over the money with a smile. Jessica, ever the instigator, couldn't resist chiming in. She smirked and told me to loosen up, calling me uptight and miserly. She laughed, saying I always had money stashed away and could afford to share a little. Her words cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just the insult, it was the complete lack of remorse, the audacity to mock me after what they'd done. I stood there, staring at them, waiting for something, anything, that resembled regret. But all I got were excuses. My dad said they'd assumed I wouldn't mind because I'm always so put together and capable. My mom added that they deserved some happiness after all they'd been through, as if that justified their deceit. Each word felt like another betrayal. They didn't see what they'd done as wrong, they saw it as a justified indulgence, a small price for me to pay for their comfort. Finally, I'd had enough. I told them, point blank, that I was done. No more money, no more support. They'd crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let them take advantage of me again. The room went silent for a moment, the weight of my words sinking in. My mom looked away, my dad's jaw tightened, and Jessica's smirk faltered just slightly. I turned and walked out before they could say anything else, leaving their stunned faces behind. But as I drove home, the anger gave way to an emptiness I couldn't shake. This wasn't just about the money. It was about trust, about family, about realizing that the people I'd thought I could rely on saw me as nothing more than a bank account. It was a betrayal that went deeper than I could have imagined. The next morning, my phone buzzed with new messages. One was from Jessica, another from my mom, and a third from my dad. They all said the same thing, they wanted to talk. There was something more to the story, they claimed, something I needed to hear. My gut told me not to trust them, but the curiosity was impossible to ignore. What could they possibly say now that would make any of this better? I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out, but I knew this wasn't over yet. When I arrived at my parents' house, it was clear the atmosphere had shifted. There were no carefree smiles or smug remarks this time. My dad looked uneasy, my mom wouldn't meet my eyes, and Jessica lingered awkwardly in the background. Something was off, and I braced myself for whatever they were about to drop on me. My dad started, his voice low and careful, like he was choosing each word with precision. He admitted that the trip to Hawaii wasn't just a vacation. It was also meant to be a business trip. They had gone to meet with an investor who was supposedly interested in funding a startup idea my dad had been working on. My mom chimed in, adding that they'd seen it as a way to secure a better future for the family. They painted the whole thing as a selfless act, something they'd done for the greater good. But all I heard was that they'd used my money for something I hadn't agreed to, something I hadn't even known about. Anger bubbled up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I asked them what this idea was and why they thought it was worth gambling so much on. My dad mumbled something about an app, something to do with real estate, but his explanation was vague and full of buzzwords that didn't mean anything. It was clear he didn't fully understand the concept himself. That only made it worse. They hadn't just lied to me, they'd thrown my hard-earned money into something they barely grasped. Jessica, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. She said she'd overheard something during the trip, something that made her think the investor might not have been legitimate. Her words sent a chill down my spine. If this so-called investor wasn't who they claimed to be, then what had my parents gotten themselves into? The idea that they could have been scammed was both terrifying and infuriating. I pressed for details, but Jessica didn't have much to offer, just vague comments and gut feelings. Still, it was enough to make me question how deep this problem went. Then came the real bombshell. My dad admitted they'd put more than just my money into this venture. They'd drained their own savings and maxed out their credit cards, leaving themselves with nothing. The sheer recklessness of it was staggering. They'd risked everything on a dream that was crumbling before their eyes. And now, with no safety net left, they were turning to me once again. I sat there, trying to process what they'd told me. The betrayal I'd felt before was nothing compared to what I was feeling now. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about their complete lack of judgment and the mess they'd dragged me into. They hadn't just gambled with their future, they'd gambled with mine, too. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if there was a way to fix any of it. The revelation from Jessica hit me like a freight train. She pulled me aside after our tense conversation with our parents and told me what she'd overheard during one of their meetings with the so-called investor. My dad had used my name as a guarantor for their investment, without my knowledge or consent. Hearing it out loud felt surreal, like a bad joke I wasn't in on. But her expression told me she wasn't joking. I went straight home and started digging into this investor. It didn't take long to find red flags. A quick search brought up countless complaints, forum threads, and even a few news articles describing the person as a known scammer. They promised high returns on investments but left a trail of financial ruin in their wake. My stomach sank as I read horror story after horror story, each one eerily similar to what my parents had described. It was obvious they'd been duped, but what scared me most was the extent of the damage. I found the contract in a folder Jessica had handed me, saying I should take a closer look. She'd been suspicious and thought I needed to verify everything myself. Flipping through the pages, my heart pounded when I saw my name printed clearly under the secondary guarantor section. My dad had signed on my behalf. It was all there, in black and white. This wasn't just reckless, it was outright betrayal. He'd put my financial stability on the line without so much as a conversation. I confronted them again, this time with the contract in hand. My dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of a day, and my mom's eyes filled with tears as soon as I walked in. They didn't even try to deny it. My dad admitted he'd been desperate and didn't know how else to secure the funding. He thought the investors' promises were the answer to all their problems. My mom begged me to understand, insisting they'd only wanted to build something that could benefit the whole family. Their words fell flat. I couldn't see past the blatant disregard for my trust and autonomy. Jessica stood off to the side, watching silently as I told them I was done cleaning up their messes. They had to fix this on their own. For the first time, I left without any guilt, just a seething anger that burned in my chest. The next morning, I woke up to an email from a law office representing the so-called investor. The message was as cold as it was infuriating. They were demanding an additional $95,000 to fulfill the terms of the contract, threatening legal action if I didn't comply. The amount was more than I could handle, and the thought of what this could mean for my future left me feeling trapped. This wasn't just a family problem anymore. It was a fight for my financial survival. Jessica's unexpected determination changed everything. She approached me the day after I received the lawyer's email, her face a mixture of guilt and resolve. She said she'd been digging into the scammer and had already reached out to several other victims. Her phone was full of screenshots and messages from people who'd lost their life savings to this scheme. Seeing her take the initiative, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way to fight back. Over the next few days, Jessica and I worked together to gather as much evidence as we could. She handled the outreach, connecting with victims and compiling their stories. I focused on organizing the information into a clear timeline of the scammer's activities. We discovered a disturbing pattern. This person had been operating for years, using different aliases and fake companies to lure people in. The scale of the operation was staggering, and it became clear that we weren't dealing with an amateur con artist. Armed with a mountain of evidence, we went to the police. At first, I was skeptical about how much they'd actually be able to do. But as soon as we laid out the documents, screenshots, and testimonies, their interest was piqued. The detective handling the case assured us they'd launch an investigation. Knowing we weren't alone in this fight made the weight on my shoulders a little easier to bear. A week later, we got the news: the scammer had been arrested. The authorities had frozen their accounts and were working to trace the stolen funds. While there were no guarantees about recovering all the money, the fact that they'd been stopped was a victory in itself. The relief was overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The fallout with my parents was inevitable. My dad, Robert, finally broke down and apologized, his voice shaking as he admitted how his pride had blinded him. My mom, Margaret, echoed his sentiments, saying they'd thought they were doing something noble but now saw how much damage they'd caused. Their words didn't erase the betrayal, but they were a step toward mending the trust that had been shattered. Jessica and I emerged from the ordeal closer than ever. Working together to expose the scam had shown me a side of her I hadn't seen before. She wasn't just my carefree younger sister anymore, she was someone I could rely on. It felt like we'd both grown in ways we hadn't expected. In the weeks that followed, I set firm boundaries with my family. I made it clear that I wouldn't be their financial safety net anymore. If they wanted my support, it would have to be on my terms. Surprisingly, they accepted it without argument. It seemed the experience had humbled them in ways I hadn't thought possible. For me, the ordeal was a turning point. I realized I'd spent too much of my life putting others' needs ahead of my own. It was time to focus on myself for a change. I began prioritizing my own well-being, finding a balance between helping others and protecting my own peace.